So today we need to begin our discussion of the rise of détente. Actually, it's going to be the discussion of the rise and fall of détente between the years 1968 and 1979. So perhaps we could talk about détente going back into the 1960s. Maybe you could say that the Test Ban Treaty of 1963, President Kennedy's speech at American University in the summer of 1963, maybe those mark a beginning of the period of détente, or at any rate, the suggestion of détente, the foreshadowing of détente. But I don't know if we can talk about a proper détente between the United States and Soviet Union, between the two nuclear superpowers engaged in the central struggle we've been arguing of the Cold War. I don't know if you could say that that's been going on during the 1960s, although it is certainly true that, as a number of people pointed out, General de Gaulle among them, President de Gaulle among them, the Soviet Union definitely is not playing a very sharp initiating role in international affairs, and certainly is taking a back seat, acting like a second-rate power, de Gaulle said, and more or less seconding the affairs or seconding the initiatives of other powers, and even to a degree you might make the argument seconding the initiatives of the United States, except that in the end the United States does support the Vietnamese communists, and the United States is waging war with communism, and the United States has really more or less subsumed all of its foreign policy basically under the heading of the struggle against communism in Vietnam. In fact, Henry Kissinger, I think, was perfectly right in saying that during the 1960s, the United States really didn't have any foreign policy. All it had was a war policy, policy of fighting the war in Vietnam. So you could make the argument that détente was beginning in the 60s, was adumbrated, was foreshadowed to some degree in the 60s, but the word started to become a common term in the media from about 1969 and 1970 with the opening to China. So that's the period we really have to talk about, have to call it the period of détente. Another way of describing it would be the period of the Nixon-Kissinger détente. That's the way you usually see it in the literature. The Nixon-Kissinger détente, then, the rise and fall of the Nixon-Kissinger détente, 1968 to 1979. Now, we're working from an outline with that title, and it has a list of topics. We can't get through all of them today. Well, probably try to get through about half of them today. Probably take the whole question of détente, the opening to China, and the related events having to do with Henry Kissinger and having to do with the transformations that are going on in the policy of the Soviet Union at the same time, and the development of an arms control regime under the aegis of the Strategic Arms Limitation treaties. So the first one then is 1972. Second one will be 1979, and the one in 1979 will be called SALT II, and so historians will date it back and call the one in 1972 SALT I. But really, there's only SALT, and there's SALT II. At any rate, those are the topics we'll take up now. We'll be reading Elbaum along with Fink. We'll be, of course, taking note of some of these CNN Cold War movies and the perspectives offered by Oliver Stone and Stephen Kuznick. It is Stephen, is it not, Kuznick? On the period. So there's a number of things that we have to guide us through this period, and I want to offer my guidelines as to how to understand the period. And as you perhaps have already noticed, I try to approach all these things in terms of winning and losing. Remember, this is a Cold War. We're treating this thing as if it is a genuine contention. We don't say war for no reason. And if it really is a genuine contention, we have to give an indication of the rise and fall of the intensity of the contention between the two powers, and we also have to talk about who's winning, who's losing, and especially since this is not a war to the finish. It's only a Cold War, not a genuine war, not a real all-out nuclear exchange. This whole question of winning and losing becomes a psychological proposition. So there we are. I'm not imposing these things on the history of the period. This is the history. So it does have this kind of aspect of winning and losing as a psychological dimension of the thing. And I'm going to be making the argument that during this period, the Soviet Union and the communist cause, for the most part, throughout the world, is winning. It's not overwhelming, but it is winning. And we have to look at Vietnam first and foremost, but before we're through, we'll look at a great many other things and draw the conclusion that the Soviet communism is seemingly getting the upper hand over the Western cause, the cause of the free world in the Cold War. My justification for putting things this way is that I'm looking at it pretty much the way the Chinese are looking at it. They are looking at the relations between the Soviet Union and the United States in terms of their winning and losing. And I'm going to make an argument that Chinese foreign policy more or less is tuned to this conception of who has got the upper hand and who the Chinese ought to be supporting. And in time-honored fashion, some people say in terms of the principles of the Cold War, I wouldn't put it so pretentiously as all that, but in time-honored fashion, the Soviets have a tendency to check on who's winning, and they feel themselves in a position as a third force in this conflict, increasingly so, at any rate, to side with the power that is losing for the perspective, for the advantage of balance. So there it is. People could say this is old-fashioned balance of power diplomacy that the Chinese know well. Henry Kissinger has made this argument very articulately and repeatedly over the years, and he is famous for it, and he has more or less imposed it on everybody. Nearly everybody buys it this way, so I don't think I'm in a minority in making this suggestion. Okay, so this is an interesting thought when you think of it as a historian, that maybe Chinese foreign policy and the twists and turns you see it making through this period are the best indication as to an answer to the general question, who's winning the Cold War? Okay, so that's going to be my lens, the lens through which I'll be looking at these things. As far as the Chinese are concerned, 1968 is an enormous turning point in the Cold War. There's a huge impact wrought on the world politics by the events of 1968. And perhaps I already got through talking about them at some length last time, so perhaps I won't enumerate them all. But just to add in the impact of the American anti-war movement, a political movement in the United States, not simply a movement of radicals or of, how to put it, a small dissident section of American public opinion. Sometimes you see it referred to that way. I don't think that's correct at all. I think you have to say the overwhelming mass of American public opinion had grown tired of the Vietnam War. And after the meeting of the wise men at the time of the Tet Offensive in 1968, as we indicated last time, I think you could probably make the case that the elites, as well as the masses in the United States, had reached a tipping point about the Vietnam War and now had gone over to the view that maybe it was just too much for the United States to accomplish. And we see during this period the rise of a number of prestigious scholars and pundits, people who have the editorship of the prestigious journal Foreign Affairs, for example, William Bundy and others, championing a school which they began to call the Solvency School, and others called it that as well, the Solvency School, the argument that the United States ought to do that which it is capable of doing. That in terms of power, the United States was living beyond its means. Probably couldn't win in Vietnam. No sense throwing any more effort into Vietnam because it's starting to hurt elsewhere, starting to turn the population of the country against the policy of the country, starting to promote even revolutionary developments throughout the world, and especially in the United States. The Chinese are looking at that pretty much in that same way, that the United States has, or I should say that the people of the United States, as the Chinese would have liked to put it at the time, the people of the United States are making common cause with revolutionary forces all over the world against U.S. imperialism and its project in Vietnam. So I think that's the way the Chinese would have put it. It's a slightly different language than we're using, but we're talking essentially about the same thing. All right, so then what does 1968 indicate? Seen as we are trying to imagine it in our thought experiment here, trying to imagine it as seen from China, how is the United States faring in the Cold War? Well, it looks like it's beaten in Vietnam. Population's against it, and as we've already indicated, the elite is pretty much against it. And then you get a pretty clear signal with a change in doctrine in 1969, once Richard Nixon came to be president of the United States, something that's usually called the Nixon Doctrine or the Guam Doctrine, from a trip that he took to Guam in the summer of 1969, made a speech, enunciated this doctrine. It has to do with the Vietnam War, and it argues that the United States can't carry the ball in Vietnam anymore. It says that there has to ensue a policy of Vietnamization of the Vietnam War. That means, of course, Vietnamese troops are going to have to do the fighting from this point on, and American troops cannot carry that burden in exactly that way anymore. They're going to support, they're going to encourage, but the main fight from this point on is going to have to be done by the Vietnamese. Why is Vietnamization? Well, the obvious reason for Vietnamization is the United States is losing the war. I mean, not only as indicated by the events of 1968, but what ensues in the army that's fighting in Vietnam in 1968, 69, 70. That is to say, the American army essentially falls apart. This is something that is not usually written about with the frankness and, how to put it, with the straightforwardness that it really requires. It is history. And the Americans love to think of themselves as people who've never lost a war, or somehow they didn't exactly lose in Vietnam. But I think you lose when your armed forces have fallen apart, when they can't fight anymore, when they are mutinying all over, when they represent a menace to their officer corps, when they are killing officers. And they are doing that in Vietnam in 68, 69. American troops introduce a new term into the press lexicon of the Vietnam War, fragging. Fragging means rolling a fragmentation grenade under the tent flap of your commanding officers. Killing officers. And killing them in combat, on combat missions. Disobeying orders. Inability to fight. Officers having to consider when they take up military missions whether they can get the troops to fight. That is to say, instead of simply issuing orders to their troops and having them followed the way it's supposed to go, have to find out what the mood is, if the troops are willing to do it, if there's a consensus in the ranks as to whether this thing can be pursued. That kind of an army is falling apart. That kind of army can't be called an army anymore. Now, I don't want to go into all the details about the army. People often cite drug use, various things. And the point of the matter is that they cannot win. They cannot win these battles. And when they fail to win, that's when they want to know what they're doing there. Any army that wants to know why they're fighting that is in doubt about why they're fighting, that's an army they can't fight. That's an army they can't fight. So that's the condition. And it's reported everywhere in the press, not sensationalized by any means and not given a proper debate the way it really needed to be. But everybody who was watching the matter knew that this was what was happening to the U.S. Armed Forces. So how can they carry on? The only thing left is Vietnamization, as Nixon began to argue at Guam in 1969. The Nixon Doctrine, it was called. What does the Nixon Doctrine mean? Let's put it in a little bit of a perspective. Suppose we put the Nixon Doctrine in terms of what we might call a Kennedy Doctrine back in the early 60s, and especially thinking about Vietnam. Kennedy said, let the world know that Americans will go anywhere. They will pay any price to defend freedom. Very stern standard to set, but let's consider the Nixon Guam Doctrine in terms of that doctrine. Nixon is now saying in Guam, in his description of Vietnamization, that, well, the United States will go some places, it'll do some things, it'll do what its solvency as a power, its ability to use force, its ability to carry out war. It'll do what is possible, but they can't do everything. And some things are beyond it. So I didn't talk that way when it started out in Vietnam a decade earlier, but things have reached that point now. So that's where Nixon, what does that mean? Nixon's going to quit Vietnam? No. He doesn't have an army anymore, but he's still got an air force. The morale in the air force is not great, but it's not reached the cracking point the way the morale in the army is, and it's still possible to carry out bombing missions. So from this point on, the United States' role is going to be in terms of the use of air power and the attempt to use diplomacy together with this air power in order to press upon the enemy the necessity to negotiate an end to the war on conditions that the United States can swallow. That is to say, peace with honor. Why should the enemy grant peace with honor to a defeated foe? Why should the Vietnamese do that? Well, there's the problem. There's the whole problem of the Nixon-Kissinger war policy on Vietnam. But their war policy is not the whole policy. They're going to have a considerable foreign policy, and they're going to be aided in various ways by changes that develop in international affairs. And so the conceit of the Nixon administration is that it is going to get by bombing, the use of air power, the use of nuclear weapons in foreign policy, to cite the title of Henry Kissinger's very sensational book of 1957. It's going to use that in order to try to get a peace with honor in Vietnam. And that's a phrase that was taken from the book on Disraeli's life, written by Robert Blake, that was very fashionable among the Nixon White House officials. They were all reading about Disraeli. Disraeli talked about peace with honor in the Middle East and the Near Eastern crisis, 1875 to 1878. There's the problem. Now, you would think this would really help the French. The French have been taking the line that, under de Gaulle, have been taking the line that the United States and Soviet Union no longer fighting the Cold War as such. The Cold War is really over. Since 1963, you could say that de Gaulle is an early herald of the idea of détente, even really before it should be. Or another way of putting this, the way Kissinger put it, Gaullism is a prefiguration, a first step of détente. Kissinger in his memoirs laid this out very carefully. he said that things that de Gaulle had argued in the early 60s, and then later on he said Willy Brandt for the Germans had argued after 1968-9 about Ostpolitik, a policy toward the Soviet bloc, which would make it easier for East and West Germany to have better relations, easier intercourse of peoples, and all the rest of that, that these were all steps to the Kissinger détente. So it's Gaullism, Ostpolitik, détente, according to Kissinger, as he lays it out in the first volume of his memoirs. And there's another idea that begins to sink in about this time. It's the notion that the Soviets are operating according to a Brezhnev Doctrine. That the Soviets are operating according to a, are we still recording? Yes. That the Soviets are operating according to a Brezhnev, so-called Brezhnev Doctrine. Remember, the Soviets have invaded Czechoslovakia in August of 1968. And the action of the Soviets in putting down this rebellion of the Czechs was immediately described in the Chinese press, not in the Soviet press, but in the Chinese press, as an example of a Soviet Brezhnev Doctrine. What is the Brezhnev Doctrine? Brezhnev Doctrine, as the Chinese described it, was we reserve the right to defend the gains of socialism wherever we can. It's sort of comparable to what one of the Tsars said in the 19th century. So wherever the Russian flag has flown, we're not going to take it down. Our country's foreign policy is designed to preserve all the gains of socialism with all the means at its disposal. Okay, that's really a way that Soviets might have put the matter. But it's the Chinese that popularized the idea that this constituted a so-called Brezhnev Doctrine. And as they described it to the West, it meant a doctrine of a kind of a Soviet triumphalism. That where the United States was collapsing in Vietnam and losing there, the Soviets were maintaining their positions in Europe. They were not failing in Czechoslovakia. They were doing what was necessary with armed force in order to keep the Soviet bloc together. And that, the way it was described and the way it was laid out, especially by the Chinese, it gave an indication that the Soviets were still robust, still strong. In fact, they had come through all the turmoil of the 1960s, revolutionary turmoil all over the world, as the only power that was still standing. After all, the United States was collapsing. Its armed forces were collapsing in Vietnam. It's going to lose this thing. And had a change of government that practically indicated the need for a peace policy. Nixon said that he was going to get out of Vietnam one way or another. He had some kind of secret plan for peace, which he wasn't divulging. We got an idea what it was fairly soon. Gaullism no longer represented a real force in world politics after the events, the revolutionary events with the French students and workers in May and June in 1968. So Gaullism is now, the French are no longer going to offer some kind of third alternative in the Cold War. The United States is collapsed. There's only one nation that's been left standing. That's the Soviet Union. At any rate, that's the Chinese analysis of the thing. And then what follows from that? The Soviets are bidding for world hegemony, and the Soviets are they're managing this bid. It's a successful bid. It's on the way to fruition. This bid for world hegemony, and what seems to follow from that is that those who warn about world hegemony are implying that they don't like it, and that they're willing to do what's necessary to oppose it, to slow it down. to stop it cold if possible. And what do they have to do in order to do that? Well, in extremis, perhaps they have to make common cause with the adversary of the one who is striving for world hegemony. The adversary would be the United States. What is this? Is this the prelude or the fanfare? That's a good way to put it, I think, better way to put it. Is this the fanfare for a Chinese reversal of alliances? Are the Chinese going to stop cooperating with the Soviets over Vietnam and start to cooperate with the United States? Well, over Vietnam, that question makes sense, over Vietnam. So that all of that is introduced by this new attitude that the Chinese start to advertise. And more than advertising it, it's dramatized by the events of March 1969 at Damansky/Jumpo Island in the Soviet Far East, the Chinese-Soviet border. Let's get a look at Damansky/Jumpo Island. It's really Damansky Island because the Russians are the ones with the troops on the island and the Chinese are not. So it's sort of like a Quemoy and Matsu, you might say. This is a kind of exposed position of the Soviets, the sore toe that the Chinese can step on from time to time. And so the Chinese are now going to start carrying out campaigns, but not of a very serious character. They're not trying to defeat the Soviet Union in war, but they are shooting at them. Artillery and mortars are used, and there's fighting going on. There are casualties in this thing. Russians and Chinese are shooting at each other. All I think, and this is my opinion, not necessarily reflected in all of the literature, historical literature on this, but in my opinion, Chinese are more or less advertising their availability to oppose the Soviets by actually shooting at them, by actually staging this thing. Not a serious initiation of a war against the Soviets, but more of a dramatization for the audience in the West, in the United States for the most part. An advertisement of Chinese availability to the West for Western purposes against the Soviet Union. So there's a Soviet map of the thing, which indicates the Chinese aggression, so to speak. That is to say, the fact that the Chinese are attacking the Soviet position rather than the reverse. You won't see it presented this way in the first volume of Henry Kissinger's memoirs, White House Years. There he actually uses the term aggression to describe the Soviets and their action in this thing. And he says that he took a look at the positions of the whole thing. He said in the East, that on the border between the Soviet Union and Xinjiang province, let's see if I get my pointer happening here. Apparently not. At any rate, you can see the border between Soviets on one side and the Chinese in Xinjiang province, a very inaccessible region for the Chinese. There's a railhead that goes right up to the Soviet positions on the Soviet side, and there's no railhead for hundreds of miles on the other side. The Chinese don't have a very good hold, and even today they don't have such a great hold over Xinjiang province. They haven't got communications, rails, all the rest of the stuff that you would need to say you really controlled it. And so it's a very inaccessible place for the Chinese to fight. So Kissinger says in his memoirs, he took one look at the map. He took one look at the map and he said, gee, the Soviets are fighting with the Chinese in a very inaccessible place. Well, this is May of 1969. But back in March, over in the east on the Ussuri River, at Damansky Island, it is the Chinese who are attacking the Soviets. So Kissinger is only trying to say that he found out the Soviets were the aggressors, or determined that the Soviets were the aggressors in this conflict, because those are the people he's going to be against. He's going to side with the Chinese side in this thing. And there's one thing more to this fact, aside from the shocking news that the Chinese and the Soviets not just quarreling with each other as to how best to defeat the imperialists, but now they're actually fighting, shooting at each other. It was revealed in the first volume of Kissinger's memoirs in a certain way, but especially revealed, laid out in the memoirs of Haldeman, one of Nixon's advisors, called The Ends of Power, published 10 years later, 1978. It was laid out that in the course of this thing, the Soviets asked the United States what would be the attitude of the United States if the Soviets decided to carry out an attack on the Chinese nuclear facilities at Lop Nor in Xinjiang province. My goodness, a Soviet request for green light on the part of the United States to attack China. So Mao's been arguing for some time that the Soviets and the Americans are sort of in cahoots against China. But here is a fairly, how shall I put it, shocking thing, a nuclear threat on the part of the Soviet Union against China. And I don't think you could say that the Chinese have been doing this all along. No, it's another big first. And moreover, asking the United States for a green light. So immediately we find from American materials available that the American officials made this information known to China. Imagine the impact in China. Colossal thought that the Soviets actually might consider an attack to destroy the Soviet nuclear facilities. This is a big step, big thing in relations between China and Russia. Big turn in this so-called split. I mean, really, we're talking about a split, but now we've crossed over, I think, into talking practically about genuine enmity. And that's the way things are going to go from this point on. And you can see it in the Chinese theoretical literature in Beijing Review and other Chinese periodicals now start to refer to the Soviets as fascists. Fascists. So that's quite a thing. Chinese analysis has really played fast and loose with accusations vis-a-vis the Soviet leadership for some time, but it hasn't been quite as bad as all this. They've criticized the Soviet leadership on the issue of Tito, relations with Tito in the 50s, you remember, and warned about revisionism, and at a certain point accused the Soviets in various ways of revisionism. Then in the 60s, they started to refer to the Soviets having restored capitalism, and this charge was made repeatedly throughout the 60s. Modern Soviet revisionism has restored. Khrushchev started to restore capitalism in 1956. And then they've said that Soviets espouse a species of social imperialism. All these are theoretically very sharp things to be saying about a communist comrade, supposedly, part of the international communist movement, if there actually were such a thing. There is not, of course. What you really have is a kind of polycentric, a loose polycentric movement rather than a movement with one center, as Mao described it in 1957. Since then, you can't say that it's got one center anymore. And then the Chinese are going to embellish on this. By 1974, they'll be arguing the famous three worlds theory, according to which the superpowers, the Soviets and the United States, they represent one world, and then there's a second world among which the Chinese are ranked. And what is seen to be suggested in the three world strategy is that the most dangerous force in the world is Soviet um, social imperialism, the Soviet threat. Fascist, they start to say, um, at about this time. Fascist. Well, on the experience of World War II, it was perfectly all right for a communist regime to make common cause with an imperialist regime against the fascists. After all, that was what happened in World War II. The communist world made common cause with the United States, Britain, everybody else who opposed fascism. So a right to join to cross the class line, in order to wage war against fascism. So now this model is now being argued by the Chinese. That is a first. So things have got very nasty with regard to the Soviets and the Chinese. This is the real Sino-Soviet split. I don't think you can say this has been the case already in 1956. No. Often one does see that argued. No, not so. It's been developing by increments. And I guess I would be among those people who argue that it has to do with a Chinese calculation as the balance of forces in the world. It only figures that they would make a calculation like that. And I think the balance is shifting in favor of the Soviets. And the Chinese are taking the view that they're going to side with the opponents of the potential hegemons. This is the traditional language of the balance of power. Henry Kissinger, of course, hearing all of this stuff, describes it exactly that way and says that they are the most inveterate, most pronounced practitioners of the idea of the balance of power as traditionally conceived in European politics. That the Chinese apply this super realism, realpolitik, you could say. They apply this to their affairs with their fellow communists. All right, so these are new developments and very powerful, huge, weighty developments. How do they affect the Vietnam War? Is it possible that these changes, even though they stem from the U.S. Defeat in Vietnam, by the way, that defeat is not complete yet. The United States hasn't thrown in the towel. It just looks like it's beaten. But how does that affect the war? So the regime of Henry Kissinger comes into power pretty much with the idea that all is not lost here. That as a result of all these changes, that perhaps diplomacy can play a huge role, not only in strengthening the U.S. position in the post-Vietnam, or at any rate, the post Vietnam War period during which American troops are doing the bulk of the fighting, over into the Vietnamization period, that perhaps all of this can be somehow salvaged, rescued by astute diplomacy. So the person who makes this argument most is Henry Kissinger. He's been on the scene for many years now. He's not really hasn't really had an opportunity to have a real foreign policy voice of his own. He hasn't been a major opponent of the Vietnam War, really not a major critic of the policy at all. He's most closely attached politically to Nelson Rockefeller. And Nelson Rockefeller, throughout the period, as we've been emphasizing, has the possibility of becoming a president, certainly a person that you could imagine him winning an election. And many in the Republican Party take this view, but many do not. So there's serious kind of rock-ribbed, Goldwaterist opposition to Rockefeller in the Republican Party. Remember, he opposed Goldwater in 1964, and he even spoke out against him at the convention, accused him of extremism. So there's just genuine split there between Rockefeller and the right-wing tendencies as represented by Goldwater in 1964. But Rockefeller still hopes one day that he will become president at this point, and it's certainly a hope that makes sense, has real prospects. As the closest person to him on foreign policy issues is Henry Kissinger. It's obvious that if Rockefeller ever becomes president, Henry Kissinger is going to be his national security advisor or his secretary of state or something similar like that, the main voice on foreign policy issues. Where does Richard Nixon stand in all this? Nixon's just become president, just become elected. Was Nixon a Goldwaterite? No, no, no. Was he a Rockefeller? Was he a Rockefellerite, if we can use that term, in 64? No, no. So Rockefeller broke very decisively with the Goldwater forces, formed a committee for Lyndon Johnson, and Nixon didn't do that. Nixon kept up his ties to the Goldwater wing of the party. So you have to think of Nixon as a kind of a centrist with regard to this major struggle that's going on inside the Republican Party. And he's got his connections with Rockefeller, and but he's got his connections with Rockefeller's enemies as well. So that's Nixon. That's the position of Nixon. And as a matter of fact, that's the reason that Nixon emerged in 1968, that they all sort of turned to him, and that his candidacy became viable. And Rockefeller has decent relations with Nixon. At any rate, he's on speaking terms with Nixon. He's willing to throw his wing of the party and all of the influence that Rockefeller represents, willing to throw that behind Nixon. But Nixon has got to accept Henry Kissinger as the foreign policy voice. Nixon was not close to Kissinger at all prior to this point. So you could make the argument, it has been suggested, it's not outrageous to say that Henry Kissinger was pretty much imposed on Kissinger, and some say in one meeting at Rockefeller's New York apartment. And that the new Nixon administration is going to have the blessing of the Rockefeller wing of the party as it takes Henry Kissinger on as the voice of its foreign policy. So this will strengthen Nixon one way or another. He'll appear as the great unifier of all the disparate Republican forces. All right, so there we are with the rise of the Kissinger perspectives on this. And what are they? Kissinger tells us all about them in the first volume of his memoirs, White House Years. He says he's going to use triangular diplomacy. By triangular diplomacy, Kissinger means that it's not, the Cold War is not just a question of the Soviets and the United States. The Chinese are a third member of the triangle. Oh, have we been operating according to that kind of a rubric so far? I don't think so. I don't think so. We haven't been saying triangular diplomacy, or we haven't been describing world politics as revolving around a triangle of three superpowers. We have not put the Chinese in the same category, but Kissinger does. And he says, from the standpoint of diplomacy, China rates as part of the triangle, and one has to make one's calculations according to that. China has been promoted, you could argue, had been promoted as a result of the rise of the Nixon-Kissinger foreign policy. And it also coincides with an opening to China. There's an article that Nixon wrote in 1968 that was kicking around the possibility that, who knows, we might be able to make common cause with China. That's an outrageous idea. Nearly everybody would have said up to this point that the Soviets are already engaging in a kind of détente or something like that. At any rate, they're not directly opposing the United States, acting like a second-rate power, as de Gaulle said, acting like a second-rate power. In fact, there's a famous expression, which, if I can remember it, de Gaulle says, the rise of a powerful and aggressive China on their eastern flank causes the Soviets to inject a note of sincerity into the couplets that they periodically devote to peaceful coexistence. So that's de Gaulle's very elegant way of saying that the Chinese are so scary, they're so revolutionary, they're so ready to raise hell in world politics that it makes the Soviets quite sincere in looking for decent relations as a kind of response. Decent relations with the West, with the United States as a response. Well, at any rate, there we have the central notion of triangular diplomacy, which is that maybe the Chinese might open up, to the West, and maybe we can work something out. I guess especially if it cuts against Russia. So that's really the point of the matter. Nixon kicked that idea around fairly early. Not much, you can't say he did much more than that, but he kicked it around. And the Chinese made a few signals, and they made some more signals. And then this huge demonstration at Demansky Island. And so that seems to solidify. Americans are certainly not going to give a green light to the Soviets. The denial of this green light is a powerful signal to the Chinese that the Americans are available to them. And so these two sides are kind of coming together. And then finally, there's this dramatic media event of a visit by Nixon and Kissinger to China. Wow. I mean, up to this point, you'd have to say, if you were asking the question, who is the United States fighting in Vietnam? I think you'd probably have to say the Chinese more than anybody else. In fact, there's enormous confusion about this in the pundit literature, strategic literature, in all of the sophisticated journals. And they say, well, who are we containing? In terms of the Cold War, who's the United States containing? Are we containing Russia when we fight the Vietnamese? Are we containing China? Are we containing both of them? Great confusion about this. And the confusion is not because the people are incompetent. The confusion is because the situation is highly fluid on the other side. It's fluid because the Soviets and the Chinese are getting the upper hand. They sense that between them, they're getting the upper hand, and it is causing them to fall out. We see that over and over again. If we look at the history of the balance of power in Europe, we've already seen it fairly sharply with the United States and the Soviet Union cooperating in World War II against the fascist powers, and then immediately on the defeat of the fascist powers, falling out. So it's no accident, I guess, we could say, that as they perceive success, and by the way, a lot of this is in the field of perceptions, but perceptions not based on nonsense, based on interpretation of facts. But as the Chinese and the Soviets perceive themselves getting the upper hand, they're falling out more and more. So Kissinger's conception then is, since this is the case, and he describes this at some length in kind of large theoretical terms, since this is the case that there is competition between the Soviets and the Chinese, the United States is in the best possible position. The third who enjoys, the tertium gaudens, the third who enjoys the favor of the others. And we have the Soviet Union and the Chinese vying with each other for our favor. You can't beat that. In any relationship among three, you can't beat that in terms of your own relationship to the other two. The other two are falling all over themselves, opposing each other in order to support you all the more. And so that's a position that Kissinger feels the United States is in. Now, the United States has to play this. So Kissinger explains how the United States is going. We're going to open up to China. We're going to get more and more friendly. The more friendly we get toward China, the more nervous the Soviets get. The more they are motivated to play ball with us. Now, this is following that de Gaulle formula that I just cited. It's kind of comparable. The more we play, so just by being nice to China, despite all that's going on, that Vietnam War is not over yet. But just by being nice to China, opening up, being friendly to China, we are giving the Soviets motives to play ball with us. And that's what we really want. So the aim of triangular diplomacy is not to get close relations with the Chinese. No, the aim is to get closer relations with the Soviets. It's the Soviets who have the real capability to destroy the United States with nuclear weapons. So to get détente, to get genuine détente with the Soviets, which is to say arms control agreements which allow us to hold down their weapons building, hold down their missile building especially. Remember, the Soviets are trying with might and main, I'll talk more about this in a second, to reach the American totals of ICBMs. And they're going to achieve this position by 1969. So the idea is to arrive eventually at strategic arms limitation with the Soviets and détente with the Soviets and an understanding with the Soviets. And more than that, a certain education of the Soviets in all of the ins and outs of nuclear strategy and deterrence. If we do that, we have a genuinely stable world. We Americans can pursue our own ends. Now, let's not go into a lot of detail about what these ends are, but we can pursue our ends in foreign policy without worrying that the Soviets are going to do something untoward or that both of us are going to slip into some kind of nuclear war. We don't want that. I mean, there's a real interest that everybody has, no matter how much we may hate each other, we don't get anywhere with a nuclear war. So that's the essence of the idea of diplomacy. And I almost forgot the most important part. At the end of all this, Chinese have opened up to us. We are more friendly with the Chinese. The Soviets are motivated. We sign arms control agreements. We have détente. We educate them about nuclear deterrence. We have a stable world order. We use all of these credits, so to speak, to impose upon the North Vietnamese a settlement that is to our liking of the Vietnam War. Even though we've lost, they're not going to win as much as they think they ought to. Does that remind you of anything? Think about the situation the French faced in 1954. They lost in Vietnam, but on account of the diplomacy of the peace at the Geneva Conference in 1954, the Vietnamese did not get everything they thought they should get. They only got North Vietnam. They didn't get the whole of Vietnam. They had to take half a loaf. Peace with honor. So the same thing now is going to apply. We're going to get a repeat in a certain way, a repeat of what Dulles and the others were able to get in 1954, when it was a question of the French being defeated. Okay, so that's the Kissinger diplomacy, which he lays out at some length in his first volume of his memoirs. Of course, he had a spellbinding way of describing the theoretical aspects of this thing, its relationship to the balance of power, his credentials as a realist, and all the rest of that before audiences of notables, of important people. He was a spellbinder. That way he has of talking and that accent, we're suckers for that sort of thing in the United States. And there he is, laying out this whole argument. So that is the way the thing did develop. The opening to China was preceded. Nixon and Kissinger went to China first, then they went to Russia. So they had big discussions with the Chinese. The Chinese soft-soaped them as much as possible. Mao even said, we opposed you as revolutionaries for a while, but that was just a lot of talk. We fired some empty cannons at one point, empty cannons. What nonsense. But this is the way he put it to Kissinger. This business about us being revolutionaries, we were only joking. And there's Zhou Enlai looking on and admiring the great helmsman and his ability to tell this story to Henry Kissinger. And Henry Kissinger is accepting this view without really, he doesn't have to really buy it, but in a way he's got to put up with it, and that's going to be the way it's going to be discussed. and they have very cordial talks. Some of these talks, there's one with Zhou Enlai far left, the interpreter between Zhou Enlai and Mao, and then Nixon and Kissinger on the right. And you see at Mao's foot is a spittoon. Is that a little footnote here? A spittoon. So nobody had been into China. It's one of the places where they actually have these. What are those things in the background there? All those, what are they? Boxes of files? Isn't that interesting? Nobody'd seen any of this stuff. The places where Chinese have their intimate talks with foreign representatives, all those things. Look at the pile of books next to Mao. Are these just props? No. Well, the spittoon is no prop. That's for sure. Maybe they're showing us the inside of their intimate foreign policy. How should I put it? Their foreign policy atmosphere. Well, at any rate, the two of them get along very swimmingly, presumably, and then the United States goes to Moscow. So Kissinger goes to Moscow with this friendship. That's all it is. There isn't anything really solid behind it beyond that. Of course, but that's plenty. This friendship with China, and has his discussions with Brezhnev. And of course, Kissinger says, oh, he took readily to the Chinese. He loved the Chinese, loved all the banquets, loved the food. And in fact, he was absolutely crazy about everything they did. And this continues all his works. You can see how much he thinks he's really become somehow linked emotionally and culturally somehow to Chinese traditions, Chinese culture, and all the rest of that. And not the case at all with Russia. There's kind of a genuine distaste. Brezhnev wants to take him hunting because he says, no, I don't want to shoot animals. I don't like to shoot animals. Gee, imagine how the Russians feel about a big statesman who won't hunt. Well, there it is. And that's Kissinger's argument then, that these prickly terms with the Russians. That's the way he liked to present it to the world. He certainly felt he had to present it that way to an American audience. Prickly relations with the Russians, kind of intimate. Intimate's not the right word, but kind of very friendly relations with the Chinese. And then at the end of this, we're supposed to end up with arms control and détente. Well, when they get back from China, Herblock, the liberal cartoonist from the Washington Post, says, oh, Nixon's back. Nixon's crawling out of the sewer. That's the way Herblock likes to view Nixon. Let's see, where have I got in my things here? I've thrown in a picture of Kissinger nowadays in a very recent meeting he had with President Obama when Obama was president. But this is the thing that we really need to look at. This is the, if you will, the military underpinning of the SALT arrangements, which is a little sketchy. There's the arms race, a feature of the arms race. We're not talking about warheads or anything like that, or total launchers either. We're only talking about ICBMs, the launchers that would be used in the early stages of a conflict and that would have their immediate impact, on which both sides would rely to destroy the other side. So ICBMs they're the main event in arms control. And so there's the position. Both of them are fighting, as you can see on the left. Both of them are fighting tooth and nail during the 1960s, between 1960 and 1965. But then the United States reaches the point, just over 1,000 missiles, 1054 was the figure, 1,000 missiles. The United States decides to lay off. So the United States gets there a little early and then lays off, waits for the Soviets. But as you see the line that describes the Soviet increase, that it intersects the American line, that is to say we have parity in these missiles at the end of the 60s. But the Soviets don't stop there. the Soviets keep building. And so by the time we get to 1972 or so, you look at this map very roughly, 1972, between 1970 and 1975, you look up at 1972 there, the Soviets have quite a number more of these things. Maybe it's 3-2 or something like that. Closer to 1,500 than to 1,000. And that's where we're supposed to start negotiating. The Soviets are way ahead in the main weapon. All the opponents of SALT will put it exactly that way, that we're getting had, we're getting taken. And Kissinger's answer to them is that, well, we're not getting taken, come on. We've got plenty of deterrent power to attack the Soviet Union. And if you want to look at the whole thing in terms of the whole nuclear triad, not just in terms of intercontinental ballistics missiles, but look at terms of submarines and bombers, the whole triad, the relationship is one of offsetting asymmetries. That's the phrase Kissinger used, offsetting asymmetries. So they have us maybe 3-2 with ICBMs, but we've got more sub-launched weapons. We've got way more bombers, and the bombers are closer than anything to them. Bombers are quite close. So it all balances out. The opposition is not going to buy this. The Republican opposition and the Democratic opposition, led by Henry Jackson of Washington State, they're going to say, no, no, no. And they're going to adopt a resolution in the Senate. They'll never put up with another treaty that codifies American inferiority the way this one does. Inferiority is the way they put it. It's not really inferiority, as you can see. Kissinger's perfectly right. There are offsetting asymmetries, and come on. But this is a way to attack it, and the opponents of the administration are going to jump on this. Now, I don't want to go into all the sociology of everybody in the United States who would be unhappy about war producers or whatever, who would be unhappy to see peace break out in regard to the nuclear arms race. But of course, there are those elements inside the United States who feel that way about it, and they have their representatives in Congress. Their point of view does get represented. But Kissinger is, I think, we have to say, I don't know. This will be something you could argue one way or the other. I think Kissinger's pretty much right. There is genuine parity here. You have to say you need a formula for this parity. So you could say the parity formulas apply. Offsetting asymmetries. The United States has not been taken as a result of SALT I. I wouldn't say that. Many are going to say this. In fact, the opposition to the Rockefeller wing of the Republican Party, soon to be led by Ronald Reagan, is going to be making the argument that the United States has been taken advantage of in SALT, that détente is a mirage, or that Kissinger is under the thumb of the Soviets and others, and that changes have to be made. Okay, so this is a major division in American Republican opinion as a result of that. In terms of the warheads, as you can see by this thing, the United States is not in the shade with regard to warheads, and the Soviets are going to have more and more warheads. So we're going to reach ridiculous standards, tens of thousands of warheads, as you can see. It's ridiculous overkill, making the rubble bounce, as they say in the military. This makes no sense at all. So in a way, it dwarfs all the other calculations. But the important thing is that we, at any rate, we haven't agreed to disarm. All we've agreed to is to control the rate of our competition in arming. So that's all SALT represents. Arms limitation, not disarmament. And that's what's indicated by this European cartoon about the American, and that's pretty much the relationship. We are both threatening the destruction of each other, and that's what gives us peace. And that's the argument, and that somehow we're all the two of us who hate each other, presumably, are going to live together. And just as a footnote here, there's a recent calculation of the the relative proportions of the powers. You see the United States and Russia have way, way more warheads than anybody, way, way more. And then among the lesser ones, the UK, France, China, and many people would put Israel in this category too. And then there's Pakistan, Korea, Pakistan, India, and North Korea, and maybe a third level. China is living on a minimum deterrent in this diagram. And there's a fairly recent graph. So China, even to our day, is not exactly competing with all the powers, although this notion of a minimum deterrent is no longer kicked around in the Chinese media. So the assumption has to be that they are building on the level of the United States and Russia, fully an equal and maybe wanting to go beyond. And when it comes to things like space and cyber weapons and things of that sort. But Soviets Chinese are going to try to live for some time, for the rest of the 20th century, I think, with a minimum deterrent. After all, that's all you need. Nobody wants to attack anybody who's got any kind of nuclear weapons, could possibly deliver any of them. We have no means, no reliable means of stopping an attack. All right, so there we have the whole question of daytime. The last thing I guess I should mention in this regard has to do with linkage, the theory of linkage. Kissinger makes at length the great argument that in détente, you've got to have linkage. So we got this détente with the Soviets, but there's got to be linkage. In other words, it's got to be on a broad front. We can't have arms control cooperation if the Soviets are misbehaving in the third world, is the argument. So that means the Soviets are actively trying to gain a march in terms of some big geopolitical change in the world, or any substantial geopolitical change in the world. That means the détente's not going to work because there's no linkage. There's got to be linkage, says Kissinger. Now, there's another argument that says, meet them in the theater in kind. That's going to be the argument of Cyrus Vance during the ensuing Carter administration, which we won't talk about today. We'll talk about it next time. They say if you don't like what the Soviets are doing in Angola, that'll be the case then, fight in Angola or do something in Angola. That doesn't affect the interests the United States has in a nuclear understanding, nuclear détente in the realm of nuclear weapons, that's say in the strategic realm. That doesn't affect it. So that's an argument without linkage. Meet them in the theater and in kind is the argument that Democrats will use. But that's not Kissinger's argument. Kissinger's is there's got to be linkage. We'll talk more about that. There's got to be linkage with regard to our next block of topics. But in 1974, let's just note in passing that the whole capitalist system starts to go through this colossal convulsion that to the communists on the other side looks like a death agony. And it has to do originally with the war in the Middle East. And there you see the position of Israel in possession of the Golan Heights, the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and Sinai after the war of 1967, and the war that will develop after 1973, or that will develop in 1973, is a war that was cooked up by Anwar Sadat, the successor to Nasser in Egypt, and it is to win the Sinai and perhaps the Gaza Strip back from Israel. And it has to do with colossal victories in the early stages in the Sinai Peninsula, at a place called Mitla Pass, just to the east of the Suez Canal, where the Egyptian forces overwhelmed the Israelis at first. And the Israelis, taking advantage of an enormous supply of weapons that the United States shipped to them, the Nixon-Kissinger regime shipped to them, made a counterattack, got through the Mitla Pass, got all the way to the Suez Canal, got into Egypt, crossed the Great Bitter Lake. You can see the Great Bitter Lake on this diagram right in here, just north of the Red Sea, Great Bitter Lake. The Israelis circled around it into Egyptian territory and were bearing down on Cairo, at which point the Egyptians started to shout for peace. Soviets started to try to get the United States to stop the thing, and of course, finally they ended up stopping it. This will look like a big victory for the Egyptians in the thing, but not really. The Israelis are going to be successful in this thing. So that's the military end of it. We'll talk about the relinquishing of the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt under Jimmy Carter by the Israelis, and how Jimmy Carter will affect that negotiation. But the perhaps almost as important, or maybe more important thing is the action of the OPEC, oil-producing countries, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. There you see OPEC. Those are all the countries involved. The main producers are the ones in the Middle East, Iran, Saudi Arabia, etc. But the others are significant. And they're going to put an embargo on oil and going to try and jack up the oil price, which they do very dramatically in the course of this oil crisis of 1973, which in the West produced a fabulous panic, a horrible thing. I remember it well. Waiting in the line 4 or 5 blocks long for gas, really horrendous, and the gas prices going up constantly. You'd think the United States was really over a barrel, as this cartoon indicates, seemingly over a barrel vis-a-vis the oil-producing countries, and especially the Mid-Eastern ones here. And it also said that Kissinger contemplated some kind of an attack on Saudi Arabia at the time of this thing. But it is also said that this thing all worked out beautifully from the standpoint of American economic interest, if there is such a thing, the economic interest of American capitalism, if we can put it that way, because the rise in oil prices rearranged all of the money flows in the world. The money that the NOPECs, the countries that had to buy oil, the money that they paid to the OPEC powers ended up burning a hole in their pockets, and these powers, especially the Mideastern powers, Iran, Saudi Arabia first, ended up depositing it all in New York banks. New York banks lent it out to the third world. The third world eventually is going to have to borrow more because it's an unending process. And the banks are able to impose conditionality on them and dictate to them how they should run their economies. So through this process of rearranging the oil flows by means of the oil shock, there are going to be 2 of them. One after the Iranian Revolution at the end of the 70s, we'll talk about it next time, that the United States will solve the problem of the overhang of European dollars that are making claims on gold. And so the United States dollar will come out of this on top of the heap. And it looks as if the Shah of Iran is now dictating terms even to the United States and the Saudis as well. And there you see a graph that indicates the 2 oil shocks and the price of oil as it goes up. But then it comes down in the 80s. We'll talk more about how that happened. And there the fate of the dollar, which is now no longer tied to $35 an ounce as was agreed in the 30s, and which is held steady right up until 1968, but which now starts to leap. And so we get to the point by the end of the 70s, we'll talk more about this as we go on, where the dollar will be, gold will be $800 an ounce. So that means the dollar is really in trouble, really in trouble. The price of gold as it goes up in dollars, means the dollar is very, very, very much in trouble. So these all look to the Eastern Bloc, if I may get to the point here. All of these economic woes, which we perhaps can't go into the way they deserve, looks to the Eastern Bloc as if it's the death throes of capitalism. Only adds to their notion that capitalism is defeated. And then there's the Watergate scandal that develops in 1974 that brought down the Nixon administration. One of the first things it did was to bring down Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew. Then when Nixon resigned, the man he had appointed in Agnew's place, Gerald Ford, Michigan, Ford became president. An appointed president is what it comes to, an appointed president. And the first thing the appointed president did was to pardon Nixon for the whole business of Watergate that had brought everybody to power, brought him to power in the first place. And who did Ford nominate for his vice president? But Nelson Rockefeller. So it's going to be Ford and Rockefeller from this point on. This cartoon says that Ford as Santa Claus is bringing you Rockefeller as a president. And this even more sharp cartoon about the relationship between Nixon, who's been driven out of office now, and Rockefeller, who's come up at the time, chooses to look at it in terms of the competition between these two gentlemen, and Rockefeller as the tortoise and Nixon as the hare. As you know, with the tortoise and the hare got winded and never made it to the finish line. The tortoise is going to win. So Nelson Rockefeller, it looked like the era of Nelson Rockefeller was now beginning to loom. Just as the Senate took up a big discussion of all of the activities of intelligence agencies and foreign policy and of the FBI in terms of the anti-war movement in the United States, which resulted in all sorts of choice reports. This is from the horse's mouth, and this is the substance for all sorts of theories about what you might call the deep state nowadays, and its various plots. So most people call it a conspiracy theory, but it is, backed up by congressional information now. And from this comes our knowledge of the FBI and COINTELPRO and all things they did vis-a-vis Martin Luther King and all the rest of that has created a good deal of literature since then. Stuff we can't go into in the way it deserves in a course like this. But our point is that in the course of all of this, Rockefeller looks as if he is on his way to becoming, well, not just vice president, but if anything happens to Ford, there were 2 assassination attempts on Ford in San Francisco outside the St. Francis Hotel and in Sacramento. If one of those had succeeded, Nelson Rockefeller would have become, by this process of appointment, whole string of appointments, no election in there, would have become president of the United States. So things were changing fast. And this represented some kind of a threat, apparently, to the wing of the Republican Party that's opposed to Rockefeller, which we can trace all the way back to Barry Goldwater. Here it's represented by Donald Rumsfeld, who's in the Ford cabinet. And Rumsfeld is gesturing to Rockefeller on a point, maybe that has to do with Kissinger, but he will soon be gesturing at Rockefeller and will trying to talk Ford into dropping Rockefeller from the ticket in 1976, and this will actually happen. So in 1975, Rockefeller got the news that Ford was going to drop him from the ticket. So Rumsfeld turned out to be the Rockefeller slayer. Who does Rumsfeld speak for here? I guess the other wing of the Republican Party, the party that's eventually going to be led by Ronald Reagan. Kissinger, remarking on this, said Rumsfeld was the most ruthless man I ever met. Well, here he makes it out to be something of a compliment, not the other things he said about Rumsfeld. And there they are wondering how this is all going to affect Henry Kissinger. So Henry Kissinger is going to lose as a result of this. In 1976, Ford is going to stop even using the term détente. So if you're looking at the fall of détente, this is a benchmark in the fall of détente, 1975, Rockefeller's dropped from the ticket. Henry Kissinger, who has two posts, a national security advisor and Secretary of State, is going to be losing face from this point on, losing power, the administration. And of course, he'll have to leave when Jimmy Carter finally defeats them in 1976 in the election between Ford and Carter. Carter, who's that? A protege of the Trilateral Commission, which was originally formed by Rockefeller, David Rockefeller, in order to promote, I think, Nelson Rockefeller. And it would have provided most of the brains behind a Nelson Rockefeller administration. Of course, that's not going to happen now. But who includes the two most important foreign policy thinkers, Henry Kissinger, shown in the center, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who's going to be Carter's secretary of national security advisor. When Rockefeller's dropped from the ticket, he was crestfallen, David Rockefeller tells us. He was crestfallen, but David Rockefeller now turns to the other leading light, intellectual light, not Kissinger, but Brzezinski, who claims to have a different approach to détente and to dealing with the Soviets, much more anti-Soviet than Kissinger. And they are going to be operating an administration under this candidate, practically unknown, in 1975, Governor Jimmy Carter of Georgia. They're going to get power in the election in 1976. And we're going to see whether the ideas of Henry Kissinger that we've been following so far, whether they're going to be continued by the Democrats. And I'll be making the argument that they are more or less going to be followed. And there's still going to be a struggle to hang on to détente in the form that we've described it, with linkage, in the next 4 years under Jimmy Carter. But it'll fail. We're going from one failure to another in the course of this discussion. And the next failure we'll have to take up when we discuss the end of détente and ask ourselves why it was that détente fell. We already have an argument as to why it rose, but we'll have to give equal attention to the whole problem of why it fell.